Hi, my name is Samantha, and I'll be your narrator for this presentation. Israel Timeline Project, a Mr. in production, with assistance from Korsha, Clip, Corporation, CCC, and Sultan Studios. So let's begin. We start our timeline in the year 1894, which is also the first of our 5 special topics. It was this year that a French Jewish artillery officer by the name of Dreyfus was convicted of treason, under unseen evidence used against him. It wasn't until 5 years later that Dreyfus had a retrial. This time he was able to see the evidence and prove it was forgery, clearing his name and restoring his dignity. Little did the world know that this was one of the first events to convince Theodor Herzl into creating a Jewish state. Next we jump 26 years later to the year 1920. This is when Palestinian leader Haj Amin al-Husseini repeatedly riots against the Jews. Israel's response to this led to the creation of the Haganah and the IDF we have today. 9 years later in the year 1929, pretty obvious if you do the math, there were a series of mob attacks in Jerusalem, Safed, and Gaza, which consisted of rape, decapitation, and mutilation. We jump 7 more years to 1936, where Husseini, with the support from the Nazis, initiates a 3-year rebellion against Britain and Israel, in attempt to end Jewish immigration. We then jump to the famous date of 1947. Here the British mandate was appealed, and Israel was made an independent state. It was right after that Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Transjordan all go to war with Israel, and lost. Talk about being the brawny man, or this brawny man, whichever. Moving on to 1949, where Arab terrorists described as Fedayeen were trained and equipped by Egypt, and stacked from bases in Lebanon, Gaza, and Jordan. Enter 1956, when Egypt increased its Fedayeen attacks, which prevented trade and shipping through the Suez Canal, which for those of you that don't know, is blocking a major trade route. With help from Britain and France, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza, but Israel left Egypt 6 months later, in assurance of unimpeded navigation, and when UN peacekeepers were stationed in Sinai. 3 years later in 1959, Yasser Arafat formed the Fatah, which would conduct guerrilla warfare operations against Israel. If that wasn't bad enough, another 5 years later, 1964, for those of you that can't mentally add, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is formed in Egypt, and carries out thousands of attacks on Israel, and others around the world, including the first airplane hijacking. Now we enter the second of our 5 special topics in the year 1967, better known as the 6-Day War. This was one of the most miraculous wars, with the combatants of Israel versus their surrounding countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon. It is a true miracle how in the given time, Israel defended itself from surrounding Arab countries, while also capturing the Sinai Desert, Yehuda Shomron, and the Golan Heights. This amazing artwork was done by Korsha Clips Corporation. In that same year, shortly after the 6-Day War ceasefire, Egyptian President Gamal Nasser ordered attacks on Israelis and Sinai. This conflict would last for 3 years. When the crisis ended, 2 years later, in 1972, for those of you that didn't get that math, the group Black September held hostage and murdered 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team. Only one was safe who didn't go because he was ill. The next year after, began the Yom Kippur War in 1973, with combatants of Israel versus Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. I won't give too much about that because I'm sure another group has it for one of their 5 main topics. We jump 9 years later to the First Lebanon War, which is 1982 and lasted until 1985, with combatants of Israel versus Syria, and the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. There are these other peoples that Wikipedia has mentioned. I'm not sure whether it's correct or not, but here is the chart anyway. And again, it's not one of my main topics, so I won't mention anything else. It wasn't long after the war that in 1987, the PLO initiated the Intifada, claiming it was a non-violent uprising. But nevertheless it turned violent. I mean, doesn't everything? One day we read about Cholan monks learning in the temples, and the next day we find this on the internet. Whatever, we're halfway through the timeline. Let's continue. By the time the First Intifada ended in 1991, the Persian Gulf War started, where US tried to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Saddam attempted to draw Israel into the war by firing Scud missiles, but to avoid disrupting the US-led coalition, Israel didn't retaliate. 3 years later in 1994, we come across the first suicide bombing, initiated by Hamas, which occurred on a bus, killing 8 civilians and injuring 55. The next year we mark our third of the 5 special topics. In 1995 Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated giving his speech at the Oslo Agreements. In hope of peace, he didn't wear a vest like usual, and was shot by Yigal Amir. Ezra should have a big picture he drew of the event to present, and just in case any mishap comes up, I'll just show you this for filler. Well, moving on. We finally come across something different, which is the invention of the flash drive in 2000. M Systems, the creators, introduced the flash drive to the US, and it instantly became more reliable and accessible than floppy disks and CD-ROMs, which I hope you've heard of before. Unfortunately that same year, and for the next 5, Israel has a large amount of suicide bombings and terrorist attacks occur. It was during that time in 2003 that Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, at 48, was killed in accident. At the end of the mass suicide bombings in 2005, we mark the fourth of our 5 special topics, which you may remember as the Gaza eviction, where Israel signed an agreement with Palestine handing over the Gaza Strip in exchange for peace. This agreement included full withdrawal, as Israeli residences there were evacuated. Some were by force.
למה? כי יש פה החלטה של ראש ממשלה פושע. יש פה החלטה של ראש ממשלה פושע שהחליט לגרש יהודים בתיהם בגלל החלטות שרירותיות, בגלל מעשיו הפליליים. תמתיסו את החרפה הזאת. מה חילול השם שקורה פה? גיל, עזב אותו. זה לשבת שם, שעתיים. פה, למגרסל. נרד למטה, נכון? זוז רגע שווה פה קטן. זוז, תן לרדת. רגע, מה עם הרגליים?
להשאיר אותי ככה, נו באמת. כל הכבוד, כל הכבוד. סבי, נצא נשואה, השתגעת?
איך הוא?
אז זה כן, מספר.
יאללה, קדימה.
אתם לא מתביישים שהרבים מסתכלים על התקשורת דבר כזה?
לא נתתי מפת...
אני מבטיח לך, אני אהיה במשפט, אני אהיה בנץ, תעצור אותך, תרים אותך. איזה קול קצת נעשה.
תירגע! תירגע!
בוא, מי עצר אותו? איפה מגב נקצר?
Now bear with me, because you may get a bit confused here, to the point where my displayed math problems won't help. In the same year of 2005, after the withdrawal from Gaza, terrorist groups have fired multiple rockets at Israel civilians, which would last for 9 years. Operations were made in order to stop rocket fire like pillar of defense and protected edge. A year after that started, in 2006, we marked the final of the 5 special topics, which was the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit. It wasn't until 5 years after he was released in exchange for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. It was also in that same year that Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev were kidnapped, sparking the Lebanon War, which you could probably guess. Yeah, in 2006 we had the Second Lebanon War. This time is the first in our wars, on this timeline, that Israel has the support of the US, which I'm curious as to how America will be of help in the coming year. Regardless, they were facing Hezbollah with the support of Iran, Syria, and whatever these other places. I have never heard of R. It was 2 years later in 2008 that Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev's bodies are returned to the State of Israel in exchange for 5 Lebanese militants. Another 2 years later, Israel creates a new breakthrough for blind, where they insert a chip into their eye, giving them sight in grayscale, which is still better than nothing, and in my opinion, is the greatest thing imaginable. Suck at Apple Watch. Unfortunately, 1 year later, in 2011, a fire starts on Mount Carmel and kills 44 people. Over 17,000 people were evacuated from the fire. What caused the fire was apparently human activity. Why am I not surprised? Now we mark the last date on the timeline, which is the invention of the Iron Dome. This is one of Israel's greatest weapons in defense, intercepting 90% of the rockets fired at Israel. Well, that concludes this presentation. Thanks for watching.